You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 10 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. If you're watching on YouTube and you notice I'm wearing the exact same getup and also with the exact same backgrounds, because I am recording these episodes back to back here in early December. Just for those that are listening, the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris and Rachel are going on vacation, so the options were we could do some back catalog episodes, or you got to record ahead of time. And since this is only episode 10 and episode 9, we don't have much of a back catalog. So I decided, you know what, let's go ahead, record some more episodes. Didn't plan that, right? Because we had a huge NAGPRA summit here at the University of Kansas this week, so it's been busy. So if you can see the hollowed out look in my eyes on YouTube, it's been a long day. It's been a long week. So if I don't have the pip in my step that I was used to, it's because I am so ready for a beer in about 45 minutes. So with that, let's go ahead and get on to the episode. So today, for this episode, episode 10, we're really, and for those that have read Doug's book, The Archaeology on North America's Great Plains, I am very much following his book format. Like, you could basically follow along to the chapters of his book to this podcast. That will change once we start like narrowing down on more just like site assemblages. We are, as the theme has suggested so far, like we're taking some broad view landscape approaches to the Great Plains, giving us that background to regional transitions, kind of starting to focus more on specific periods within the Great Plains, some case studies, you know, just to get us like some background. And then we will get into, let's just look at one site, go through everything that's happened. But for now, let's just continue to build upon what's happening in the Great Plains at large. So episode 8, we looked at the early Archaic. Episode 9, we looked at the middle Archaic and some of the more fascinating cultural developments in the Northwest Plains with the medicine wheels and cairns that are being built in Wyoming, Montana, Alberta, right? But now we're going to look at the late Archaic. And as this theme has continued, that most of the changes we see in the Great Plains socially and archaeologically happen along the Missouri River drainage and in the eastern part of the Great Plains. The western part of the Great Plains, by and large, stays the same. People are going out there to hunt, right? Bison, especially after the Paleo-Indian period when all the elephants are gone. Bison, bison, bison. So today we're going to go back to my neck of the woods here in Kansas. We're going to be looking around the Kansas City area in Missouri and northeastern Kansas in the late Archaic. So when is the late Archaic, right? The Archaic period itself, approximately 7200 BC to 500 BC. The late Archaic is approximately 1200 BC to 500 BC. And what we're starting to see now, right? Paleo-Indian period, 1300 sure, to 7200. That's a long stretch of time. Archaic, 7200 to 500 BC, with early and middle, like our units of time. What differentiates these periods are getting smaller. They're getting tighter. So things are starting to change a little bit more rapidly. Here in the late Archaic, right, this is a 700-year period that we're talking about changes. So in particular, what am I talking about with I keep saying Hopewell. We're not looking at Hopewell. That's later. We're going to look at a place called Nebo Hill. Nebo Hill, for those that are inquiring, I am the curator of archaeology here at the University of Kansas, and the Nebo Hill collection is under my stewardship. It is right here. If you were to sit down in my seat here in my office and look out my door, you can see the drawers that we have Nebo Hill. Nebo Hill is fascinating. So we're looking at Kansas City, Missouri. And then this late Archaic changes a little bit down south at what we call the Wistar phase in eastern Oklahoma. We still have generalized hunting and gathering. And we're seeing some connections to groups to the east And at Wistar phase, there's actually very little bison present. In fact, at these assemblages, we're finding lots of nuts, deer, and turkey. That's not very plains-like. And we're seeing like fish hooks appear made out of bone. We're seeing a little bit more connections going on in the southeastern part of the country. We're starting to see here in the late Archaic, right? In middle Archaic, we were talking about how we can see these possibly discrete social groups and cultural groups develop. That continues, do not get me wrong, but what we're seeing in the late Archaic are these social groups, these distinct social groups and cultures interacting with people far away other than their immediate neighbors. We're starting to see probably movement of people. So looking at the Nebo Hill phase and the site, it has a lot of similarities to not only, its immediate area, but the Sedalia complex, the Tittering focus out in Illinois, but also some sites in Florida and Georgia. And what are these similarities, you might be asking? Like, what's going on? Well, one, the projectile points. They're different. They're not fluted. They're not notched. They're ovular. They're like these, and they're long. And we start to see grooved axes. So like looking at these like really hard stones that we're starting to see like hundreds of man hours to put grooves in these basalt stones, but also monos and metates. And silica polished hose. We're seeing a broader lithic industry, lithic being, human modified stones for tools. We're seeing them beyond just the hunting and gathering. We're starting to see a lithic industry develop that is, like I said, beyond hunting and gathering, or really hunting, right? We're not talking about just knives and points. But we also see pottery for the first time. Fiber tempered pottery in Nebo Hill in St. Louis. And around the same time, we're seeing fiber tempered pottery on the coasts of Florida, on the coast between North Carolina and Georgia, and along the Mississippi drainage in Louisiana and Alabama around the same time. Am I saying these are the same people? No. All these groups where we're seeing this pottery are connected via waterways, but something is happening. Pottery is new. Pottery is fascinating technology, by the way. Pottery is one of those, what seems to be these natural human technological advancements that happen independently from one another all across the globe, from Japan, the Fertile Crescent, South America, the United States. Pottery happens. Everyone develops it independently. It's in the late Archaic, outside of Kansas City, that we see the first evidence of pottery on the Great Plains, which is fascinating. And to see these connections with the Southeast are also incredibly fascinating. That something that's happening across the continental United States is speaking to, continental connections. And the discovery of the states, the two major pottery types that appear at this time period, like Nebo Hill dates to 1750 BC, which is kind of late Archaic. But I do want to say, like, the pottery does appear first in the Southeast, but we have it along the Missouri River drainage outside of Kansas City, Missouri. So what is going on? Well, like I said, the points are really distinctive. And the fact that we have pottery, like, that's just such a huge thing, because like pottery suggests, right? Like, not only do we have pottery, we have the grooved axes and we have the hose. Those are not things that full-time mobile hunting and gathering people have. Like one of these grooved axes not only takes a long time to make, but they're heavy. So with pottery, like, especially with how fragile pottery is, like, could you imagine being a backpacker and carrying pottery with you the whole time? Like, even the Walmart stuff that you buy, like the plaster stuff, like, that breaks, right? Like, if you've ever gone backpacking, you don't take Tupperware you vacuum seal plastic bags. Like that's what's one, it's going to be lighter, but two, that's what's going to survive. We're starting to see evidence of sedentism. People are staying in the same place longer. And this has been a theme that we've kind of been building to, right? When I've been talking about archaic and we're seeing these boundaries of social groups, and it starts to become more and more bounded. There's appear to be distinct boundaries and homelands and territories. It's hard to see with just the points, but when you have fragile objects such as pottery and tools associated with agriculture, I'm not saying these people have agriculture by any stretch of the imagination, but we're getting there. We can start seeing the stepping stones that people are getting to this. We have the toolkit developing that would be associated with a fully agricultural system. That doesn't come till later, but we're starting to see some prerequisites for agriculture, horticulture. It's starting to show up. Now, Nebo Hill itself, it comes and goes. And it hasn't been super intensive. Like if you look up Nebo Hill in Plains Anthropological Society and Plains Anthropologist, it's there. Like a lot of early stuff from the 40s and 50s was very much on Nebo Hill. That stuff is wildly out of date, but it is still, a work in progress. What is happening in the archaeological record? And so really for the theme, what my takeaways for you, my dear audience, what is Nebo Hill? Why is it significant? Pottery, number one, increased sedentism, number two, and a much more diverse artifact assemblage with the hoes, with the grooved axes and mauls, and also we're seeing in places around Nebo Hill and in the eastern part of the Great Plains, there are sites and phases with much more woodland settlement patterns and subsistence strategies, right? Like when you don't have bison in a Great Plains site, that tells you something. Like it's like, wait a minute, why aren't there bison? And like I said, with that phase with Oklahoma, right? It's deer and doing a lot of nuts and stuff. That's very similar to what's going on in the east. So Late Archaic pottery, distinct geographic areas, larger assemblages, but intercontinental interactions. And with that, we'll be right back with the second half of episode 10. So welcome back. I kind of blew through Nebo Hill pretty quickly because really those are the takeaways from Nebo Hill ceramics and some of the other cool stuff. So we're going to take the second half of this to what else is going on in the Late Archaic? What other big changes? It can't just be Nebo Hill. And you're right. The Northwest Plains is becoming very dominant in bison kills. So we've talked about bison jumps in the Middle Archaic. The Late Archaic, they're continuing and increasing the amount of bison they're running off cliffs. So head smashed in particular, we're seeing 3 to 4 meters of dense bison bones. I just blue screen, sorry. So, but at the Cobalt site in Wyoming, which is another bison jump, we're seeing not only jumps, but also arroyos are being killed or being utilized for bison kills. They're specifically tied to Yankee points. Yankee points, they're these projectile points that have these side notches, but they have ears at the bottom. And there's limited bone processing. And what we can look from the bones of these bison, it's often just meat just stripped from the bones, which is strange. Cobalt is up there in northeastern Wyoming. But we're also seeing mortuary practices become more common. And when we look at bracken cairn in Alberta, we're seeing cremation occurring. And so things tying back to the theme of increased social boundaries, how you treat your dead is a huge indicator for identity. And we're starting to see more of these mortuary practices specifically being tied to places at regional levels. Once again, backing these assumptions and interpretations of we're seeing socially discrete units of people, right? It's not just a wild group of hunter-gatherers doing the same thing. Enough time has passed from migration where there are discrete boundaries. And not to say that those boundaries don't overlap. They absolutely do. But we are seeing discrete social units and really identity forming, or if not hasn't already formed. And looking at the Kaplan Hoover site in Windsor, Colorado, which is a late archaic site, about 900 BC, we get like an early single fall kill site. It has those same Yankee points present. And looking at these middle to late archaic changes overall, what is happening? In the northwestern plains, we have large-scale bison hunting increasingly tied to specific localities, and they are very much reliant on substantial human investment, not only in terms of processing the bison, but also in developing the landscape to increase the probability of successful large-scale bison kills. People in the northwestern plains are changing the environment to make sure they can kill bison effectively, and a lot of them. Now, the variation in intensity of carcass processing, there is more intensity to the north and less to the south. That speaks to something, right? So in the northern parts of the plains, you're going to expect to see more intensity than the southern part. Everywhere else on the plains, with the exception of Nebo Hill, of course, in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, basically people are doing the same kind of hunting from Paleo-Indian times. That doesn't change. But in the eastern part of the plains is again where we begin to see a lot more local variation, but there's a lot of similarities in the assemblages with the east. So western part of the plains, pretty much doing the same stuff that they've been doing since Paleo-Indian times. Eastern part of the plains, a lot more variation. And their assemblages look very similar to southeastern Midwest archaeology, right? There's deer, corn, stuff like, not corn, sorry. I meant to say acorns and forgot to add the acorn part, the A to the acorn part. This is important for what comes in the woodland period, which we'll dive into in the next episode, I think. Although, like, I'm already, to be honest, everybody, my brain is fried. It has been a long week. So I know this episode's not going to be my best. And frankly, the archaic period, I think I prefaced this before. In terms of Great Plains archaeology, the archaic period is my least. I don't know very much about it. Fundamentally, this is very much just like, Doug's book, right? Like I can speak to Paleo-Indian and Hell Gap. I went to Wyoming for my master's. I know Paleo-Indian, like I know that literature very well. My PhD is all on plains village farmers and social identity and ethnogenesis and radiocarbon work. The archaic exists between those 2 points, and it shows in these podcast episodes on archaic where I'm going through Doug's book, like, let's just hit the major points. Like it's much more difficult for me, just to be honest. The archaic, that is my weak link in archaeological history. But tying this back to themes that are continuing on from in the middle archaic, like in the middle archaic episode that we talked about in episode 8, right? Or episode 9, sorry, and 8. We're seeing regional differences, not only in the processing of bison, but even like we talked about the roasting pit features, the prevalence of them south versus north. So we can look at this from a overhead view as, well, there's some environmental determinism at play here, Carlton. And I'm not disregarding that. Like, one of our early episodes was just on the geography and climate of the Great Plains. That it does have an effect on cultural development. But as time progresses and people become more specialized and regionally focused, those differences become, much more readily available to be seen between sites, between like Alberta and Texas. Right? We see in the middle archaic people in the northwest part of the plains, Montana, Wyoming, Alberta, they're having a very obvious cultural development in the Great Plains with the medicine wheels and the cairns. The eastern part of the plains near the Missouri River, there's connection with eastern populations in the archaeological record. Probably through the riverways of some way, shape, or form. There are roasting features between the south and northern part of the plains. There's a difference in intensity. Now they're butchering bison, right? Like in the north, it gets colder quicker, and like very much maybe the readily available gathering subsistence practices are not at, their growing season's not as long, which I'm not saying they had agriculture, but I am saying the availability of gatherable plant life is not as broad as it would be in the south or to the east. Therefore, you have to kill a lot of bison, process a hell of a lot of bison to make sure you can get through those horrendously difficult winters up north. So these are all playing in the past to, once we get closer in time, and as agriculture does take place, there are differences in the communities and populations already that then become exacerbated as time continues, right? So it's like, you look at a Venn diagram or a tree of life or something, right? The Archaic period is really overall when we do start seeing the divergences of populations from Paleo-Indian times that we can distinctly see in the archaeological record through the features, through their different cultural practices of subsistence strategies and cultural material. And as time progresses, we get to the woodland period and then definitely the Plains Village period, there are really distinct social units. And so this is just me kind of reinforcing, like, the Archaic is really that time from early, middle, late that these differences are beginning, these separations are occurring, and that they are distinct enough that they can be seen in the archaeological record. So I guess that's like my TLDR of the Archaic period. Things are changing. People are specializing in their different areas. We're seeing culture appear. That's the Archaic. And with that, I'm going to go get dinner. It's been a week. Everyone, you all enjoy. Have a happy holiday season. This episode is coming out on the day after Christmas. So I hope everyone who follows that holiday had a happy Christmas. I will see you all next time back in January after the new year. So long. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultura Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.